database administration, system performance tuning for MySQL. So one of the duties of a database administrator is to make sure that the database is performing well. So how do we do this? Number one is to balance the four main hardware resources. And what are the four main hardware resources? These are the storage, the memory, the processor, and network. So let's take a look at storage. So for storage, take a moment to evaluate your storage. If you're using traditional hard disk drives, HDD, you can upgrade to solid state drives for performance improvement. You can also use a tool like IOTAP or SAR from Systat package, that is for Linux, to monitor your disk or input-output rates. If this usage is much higher than usage of other resources, then you can consider adding more storage or upgrading to faster storage. On Windows 10, you can actually open your control panel and then system security, then administrative tools, and then you look for performance monitor just to check the performance of your storage and actually other resources. So you can open the resource monitor, or you can also open the performance monitor. So this is the resource monitor. So you can see here, if let's say for example your disk or maybe your memory is not performing well. Or here's the performance monitor. So you can click on this and then you can click on plus, and then maybe you can choose physical disk, and then you can add the following, and then maybe you can view the report. So if you view the report, you can see here some values, and this will make you analyze the performance of your storage. The next is of course the processor. Processors are usually considered the measure of how fast your system is. So use the Linux top command for a breakdown of how your resources are used. Pay attention to MySQL processes and the percentage of processors usage they require. On Windows, you use the same tool as that of the storage, but this time you add all necessary counters or for processor performance. So just like what we have shown a while ago. You can also use the task manager, and then the task manager you can look at processes and you can see how many percent of the processor is being used by maybe MySQL. Then we have memory. So memory represents the total amount of RAM in your MySQL server. You can adjust the memory cache and to improve performance. If you don't have enough memory, or if the existing memory isn't optimized, you can end up damaging your performance instead of improving it. Like other bottlenecks, if your server is constantly running out of memory, you can upgrade by adding more. If you run short of memory, your server will cause data storage, so like a hard drive, to act as memory, and database caching slows down your performance. Then the last one is the network. It is important to monitor network traffic to make sure you have sufficient infrastructure to manage the load. Overloading your network can lead to latency, drop packets, and even server outages. Make sure you have enough network bandwidth to accommodate your normal levels of database traffic. So again, these are the four main hardware resources that we should be constantly monitoring. So the next one is to use InnoDB, not MyISAM. So MyISAM is an older database style used for some MySQL databases. It is a less efficient database design, and the newer InnoDB supports more advanced features and has inbuilt optimization mechanics. InnoDB uses a clustered index and keeps data in pages, which are stored in consecutive physical blocks. If a value is too large for a page, InnoDB moves it to another location, then indices the value. So this feature helps keep relevant data in the same place on the storage device, meaning it takes the physical hard drive less time to access the data. So that is what is good about InnoDB. Is this one, it's stored in consecutive physical blocks. So that means that the data are placed in the same or more or less near to each other. That's why it will take lesser time to access data. Then again, to optimize performance, you should always use the latest version of MySQL. So using the latest version is not always feasible for older and legacy databases, but whenever possible, you should check the version of MySQL in use and upgrade to the latest. A part of the ongoing development includes performance enhancements. Some common performance adjustments may be rendered obsolete by newer versions of MySQL. In general, it is always better to use native MySQL performance enhancements over scripting and configuration files. We can also consider using an automatic performance improvement tool. As with the most software, not all tools work on all versions of MySQL. We will examine 3 utilities to evaluate your MySQL database and recommend changes to improve performance. So these are, the first is the Tuning Primer. So this tool is a bit older, designed for MySQL 5.5 to 5.7. It can analyze your database and suggest settings to improve performance. For example, it may suggest that you raise the query cache size parameter if it feels like your system can't process queries quickly enough to keep the cache clear. Then the second tuning tool that we can use, so for most modern MySQL database, is the MySQL Tuner. This script, MySQL Tuner.pl, is written in Perl like Tuning Primer. It analyzes your database configuration, looking for bottlenecks and inefficiencies. The output shows metrics and recommendations. And this is available in github.com. So here's an example of the screen for MySQL Tuner. But this one is in Linux, Ubuntu. So if you run the program, so here are some of the recommendations. Especially if you see this one, then that means it needs some sort of an action. So the script works with MySQL 8.x. Log file recommendations are the first on the list, but you should scroll to the bottom. You can see general recommendations. So that we have here the general recommendations for improving MySQL performance. So here we have here the general recommendations. Then, so aside from what are the first 2 utilities, Tuning Primer and MySQL Tuner, we also have the PHP MyAdmin Advisor. So more or less we already have this. So like the other 2 utilities, it evaluates your database and recommends adjustment. If you're already using PHP MyAdmin, the Advisor is a helpful tool you can use with the graphical user interface. Then we should also optimize queries. A query is a coded request to search the database for data that matches a certain value. There are some query operators that by their very nature take a long time to run. If your environment relies on automated queries, they may be impacting performance. Check and terminate MySQL processes that may pile up in time. Use indices where appropriate. So many database queries use a structure similar to this. Select, then where we have the where clause. These queries involve evaluating, filtering, and retrieving results. You can restructure this by adding a small set of index for the related tables. The query can be directed at the index to speed up the queries. So for example, you have here select where e-name. So we are always looking for employee name. Then you can improve performance if you index name. So the fields that you always use for the workflows can be indexed. But of course, it says here only where appropriate, because if you abuse the use of index, it will also affect the performance, especially when it comes to insert, update, and delete, or the DMLs. Then functions in predicates. So avoid using a function in the predicate of a query if necessary. So for example, select asterisk from my table where, so you place the function of the my where close. So the upper notation creates a function which has to operate during the select operation. This doubles the work the query is doing and should be avoided if it is possible. Specify columns in the select function. Now usually a common expression is to use select asterisk to scan all the database columns, but if you specify the columns you need, your query won't need to scan irrelevant columns, so this will make the performance faster. Use the order by appropriately. The order by expression sorts results by the specified column. It can be used to sort by two columns at once. These should be sorted in the same order, ascending or descending. If you try to sort different columns in different order, it will slow down performance. So again, if one is ascending, the other one is descending, it may slow down the performance. You may combine this with an index to speed up the sorting. Join the union and the distinct. Try to use an inner join whenever possible. An outer join, so that is the left join or the right join, look at additional data outside the specified columns. That's fine if you need that data, but it's a waste of performance to include data that won't be required. So if it is not required, you always use inner join, not left join or right join, unless, as mentioned here, you really need that data from the other table. The union and distinct commands are sometimes included in queries. Like an outer join, it's fine to use these expressions if they are necessary. However, they add additional sorting and reading of the database. If you don't need them, it's better to find a more efficient expression. Then we can also use the explain command. Modern MySQL databases include the explain function. Appending the explain expression to the beginning of a query will read and evaluate the query. If there are inefficient expressions or confusing structures, explain can help you find them. You can then adjust the phrasing of your query to avoid unintentional table scans or other performance hits. So as an example, you can type explain select asterisk from store, for example, and this will give you some information about the query, like for example, what kind of select type, what is the table used, possible keys used, etc., and how many rows are there in the table. So this will give you an idea of the tables used or information about the query. MySQL Server configuration. So this configuration involves making changes to my.cnf or my.ini, especially in Windows. This one is, I believe, in Linux. So proceed with caution and make minor changes at a time. If you're using Apache or using XAMPP rather, you can open the XAMPP control panel and then click on this to open the my.ini file. So here are some of the things you can change: the maximum connection, the query cache size, the InnoDB buffer pool size, the InnoDB I/O capacity. So the query cache size specifies the size of the cache of MySQL queries waiting to run. The recommendation is to start with small values around 10 MB and then increase to no more than 100 to 200 MB. With too many cache queries, you can experience a cascade of queries waiting for cache data. If your queries keep backing up a better procedure is to use explain to evaluate each query and find ways to make them more efficient. So the explain command was mentioned a while ago. Max connection refers to the number of connections allowed into the database. If you're getting errors citing too many connections, then increasing this value may help. We also have the InnoDB buffer pool size. This setting allocates system memory as a data cache for your database. If you have the large chunk of data, increase this value. Take note of the RAM required to run other system resources. InnoDB I/O capacity. This variable sets the rate for input and output from your storage device. This is directly related to the type of speed of your storage device. A 5400 RPM HDD will have a much lower capacity than a high-end SSD or Intel Optane. You can adjust this value to better match your hardware. Conclusion. Before the conclusion, so I would like to say something. So we have noticed that, let's say, the four hardware for hardware resources that you should monitor are storage, memory, and processor. Now, usually, what in bigger companies or bigger databases, we actually have a dedicated server for the database to improve the performance. So when you say a dedicated server, the database is placed on a different computer. So since it is placed in a different computer, there will be lesser contention with storage, memory, processor, etc., and network. So that's another way of improving the performance of your database. So let's proceed to the conclusion. You should know how to improve MySQL performance and tune your database, especially if you're the DBA. Look for bottlenecks, hardware and software, so queries that are doing more work than needed, and consider using automated tools and explain function to evaluate your database. So that ends my lecture for today. Thank you very much for watching.